If Christ is risen, nothing else matters. If Christ is not risen, nothing else matters. Now that's not my quote, that's from a guy called Yaroslav Pelikan. He's a Christian theologian. But what he means by it is this: if Jesus is risen from the dead, then when it comes to Christianity, that's the end of the discussion. Literally everybody should become a Christian, because Jesus went around saying, I'm God, you're going to kill me, and then I'm going to rise from the dead. And then they killed him, and then he rose from the dead. And he went, I told you so. If he's risen from the dead, then it doesn't matter if you feel anything, it doesn't matter what other objections you may have.
It doesn't matter!
All of that is secondary. Now on the other hand, if he's not risen from the dead, then that's the end of Christianity. If his body decomposed somewhere outside of Jerusalem, then Jesus was not God. He was either a liar or a lunatic. If that didn't happen, then the whole thing is a scam. His early followers were a bunch of mixed up people following the insane ramblings of a madman who died as a peasant criminal outside the walls of a mid-sized ancient Middle Eastern city. And by the way, that's not just a logical position, that's the Bible's position. The Apostle Paul writes that if Jesus is dead, then Christians are among all people to be most pitied. Those Christians being persecuted for their faith are being persecuted for no reason. Those who live a life of spiritual discipline are wasting their time. Those who walk around in robes and pointy hats still look awesome, but it's accomplishing nothing. So this is the most important question in history. And indeed it is the most important question in your life. And just in case you couldn't guess from the title of this video, I'm going to give you 3 reasons to believe that this actually happened.
Go for it.
Reason 1. Jesus' tomb was definitely empty. It is a historical fact that the body of Jesus of Nazareth was put in a tomb, and 3 days later that tomb was empty. We're told that the body of Jesus was put into a tomb that belonged to a man called Joseph of Arimathea. Now this was a well-known guy. He was a member of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish leadership council in Jerusalem at the time, and he was something of a local celebrity. In Northern Ireland it would be like Rory McIlroy, Jamie Dornan, yours truly. But not only that, he asks another well-known guy, Pontius Pilate, for permission to put Jesus' body in his tomb. So if the followers of Jesus were just making this up and they had put the body in some other tomb, those guys could have both been contacted and said, nope, the body was never in that tomb to begin with. And bear in mind, yes, Joseph was a believer, but Pilate definitely wasn't. Pilate was involved in putting Jesus to death. He would have no reason to lie about this. Furthermore, we know the tomb was empty because Jesus' enemies agreed that the tomb was empty. Neither the Jewish leadership nor the Roman leadership in Jerusalem at the time were fans of Jesus. To the Romans, he was a political nuisance. To the Jews, he was an existential threat and a blasphemer. But here's what they said about the body of Jesus: that it was stolen from the tomb by the disciples.
You're thieves.
Their story itself says that the body is not in the tomb. And in the weeks and months to come, when Christianity took off after the day of Pentecost and they were desperate to put a stop to it, they could very easily have done so if the body had been in the tomb. The whole premise of Christianity's growth was that Jesus was risen from the dead. If they could simply have gone there and went, look, the body is there, then quite simply Christianity would have been stopped dead in its tracks. No pun intended. So that's reason 1. 3 days after Jesus died, his tomb was empty. Reason 2. There were hundreds of eyewitnesses who claimed to have seen Jesus bodily risen from the dead and who died for those claims. So after the last argument, you might go, well, we accept that the tomb was empty, but it might well be the case that the disciples got in there and stole the body. So let's examine that claim. On the night that Jesus was arrested, his disciples were with him, and they were armed. And we see that Peter takes a swing at one of these guys with a sword and manages to cut off his ear, which is not the sign of a great swordsman. After that, all of the disciples run away and hide in the darkness. After Jesus died, the Jewish leadership were worried that the disciples would break in and steal the body, so they asked permission for a Roman guard to be set outside the tomb. Now, the group that arrested Jesus in the garden was basically a rabble, but the ones that were set outside the tomb were Roman soldiers, the best soldiers in the world. So if you believe that the disciples stole the body, what you're saying is that this group of incompetent cowards in 3 days managed to transform themselves into SEAL Team 6. And they managed to defeat this armed guard, yet without hurting any of them or killing any of them, because they would have been arrested and executed for doing that. So this same group of people that ran away from a rabble, Jedi mind tricked their way past the best soldiers in the world.
They Jedi mind trick you.
Yes, they do.
You know what I'm saying?
And even more incredibly, they decided to wait until after Jesus was dead to launch such a rescue mission. I'm not sure if you've heard about many rescue missions in your day, but they are typically conducted when the person being rescued is still alive. But what's even more startling about this idea that they were just making this up is that someone might well lie for something like that, but they would only do so if it was to their advantage. They would do it for fame or money or women. And yet these guys, they don't get rich at all, they lose pretty much everything, they don't get famous, they get hated, and they stay faithful to one wife. 11 of the 12 apostles go on to die for that claim. I'm sure most of us at some point have told a lie to make ourselves look good. But I guarantee that if people were going to execute you unless you recanted that lie, you would absolutely take it back.
I was lying, sorry.
Yet none of these guys did that at any point. Now some people might say, okay, well they believed it, but maybe they hallucinated. However, we have stories of 500 people, and we know the names of many of them, who all saw Jesus at the same time after his death and saw him in the flesh. And they all agreed on what he did. If me and 499 of my friends did acid one day, one of us might see a pink elephant, another one might see a person with wings, a final one might be able to understand Joe Biden.
Mobilize true international effort to pressure.
But that's not the same as 500 people agreeing on the things that happened. Furthermore, they said they touched him, they said he ate with them. Mental projections are not good at eating food. And one final pushback on this area is this, that perhaps Jesus didn't die. Maybe he just passed out from the pain and they put him in the tomb and then he recovered his consciousness and managed to escape. And that theory is called swoon theory. I like that name. It sounds like something out of a Jane Austen novel. A couple of reasons why that doesn't work though. Firstly, the Romans were expert killers. We know that water and blood flowed out of his side, which is basically the red blood cells and the plasma in the blood separating, which only happens after death. So they knew he was dead. But not only that, imagine you had just received the beating of your life, been nailed to a cross for 6 hours, and then locked into a cave with no food, water, or medical attention for 3 days. Do you think that we could bring you out and manage to convince people that you were the Son of God back from the dead?
That seems unlikely.
So that's reason 2. There were hundreds of eyewitnesses who died for the claim that they literally saw him after he was dead. Reason 3 is this. The appearances of Jesus radically altered people's beliefs. We'll start with the disciples here, because interestingly, they had no expectation that Jesus was going to rise from the dead. If we look at their actions, they were not sitting around hoping that he would come back, eyeing up the tomb, checking whether or not he would rise. They were scattered, abandoned, in hiding, not knowing what to do. They were devastated. They had thought that Jesus was the Messiah. They had expected him to come as a conquering king. They wanted him to drive the Romans out of Israel. They were not expecting him to be beaten and die as a criminal on a cross. And the Jewish people as a whole did not expect resurrection in the middle of history. Even the Old Testament passages which talk about this do so in a way that is only easy to see in hindsight. For the disciples, it's like they would have had to have come up with this thing out of thin air and all adopt it simultaneously. What they saw of Jesus after he had died convinced them to radically change what they believed. But that's not even the most exciting bit. The most exciting bit is the change in belief among people who did not accept Jesus. If you read the Gospels, you will see that Jesus' family did not believe him when he said that he was God. Jesus' own brothers came to restrain him and put an end to his ministry at one point. And yet what we see after the resurrection is that James, Jesus' brother, worships him as God. Just imagine what it would take to provoke such a turnaround in thinking. I have a brother. He's a nice guy, but if one day he decided to say to me, by the way, I'm God, worship me, he would get what we call in Northern Ireland a swift dig. What could change your mind about your brother to think that he is God? I think the only thing that could do it is rising from the dead. Or what about the Apostle Paul? Bear in mind that he hated the church. He was imprisoning and killing church members. He was a man who spent his entire life becoming the most radical, zealous Jew possible, which necessarily made him persecute the early church because he viewed it to be a heresy.
Neighbor,
I heard about your heresy.
And yet, after seeing the resurrected Jesus, he gives his entire life to refuting the things that he had taught and believed. That's like Osama bin Laden releasing a video and saying, guys, I've seen Jesus, I'm leaving Islam, and I'm now going to start Taliban Church here in Afghanistan. That's a wildly convincing turnaround, and that's reason 3. Number 1, the tomb was empty. Number 2, there were witnesses who died for their claims that they'd seen him alive. And number 3, the people who claimed to see him alive had their beliefs radically changed as a result of seeing him, including people who didn't believe in him at all. As I said at the start, if Jesus rose from the dead, nothing else matters. Your preferences, your lifestyle, your preconceived notions, anything else you want to throw in there, they're all irrelevant. A man who can claim to be God, who can predict his own death, go to that death willingly, go into the grave and come out again, is completely vindicated in his claims of divinity. A Jesus who is risen is a Jesus who is God. He is risen. He is God. Nothing else matters. Follow him. So, turns out I forgot to film this little end bit where I ask you to like, subscribe and support the channel. So if you would like to like, subscribe and support the channel, you can do that. You can do so on PayPal or Patreon. I really do appreciate it. It's helping me keep this thing going. And to those of you who have bought some apparel from wearecontramundum.com, thank you once again so much. Please do check all of those things out. Links are in the description. Thanks so much.